and welcome to Trekosophy, the podcast about the philosophy of Star Trek. Joining us tonight, our fearless leader, the Aristotle of Andoria, Ben McLean.
Okay.
Awesome.
And also, damn it, Tim, he's a philosopher, not a doctor. It's Tim Davidson.
Thank you.
And our technical advisor, straight back from his trip through the wormhole, Brendan Kirby.
Good day.
And our chief engineer, the guy who doesn't just have a tricorder, he's got a quadcorder, Chris McGee.
Good evening.
And once again, I am Bill Allen, a.k.a. the guy in the red shirt. And tonight's episode is about the prophets.
Throughout Deep Space Nine, the prophets sort of bathe the show in this sort of glow or aspect of the supernatural that really isn't present, at least not in the same solid, continual sense through the rest of Star Trek. I mean, Q isn't exactly like the prophets. He's more of, he's a lot, pretty silly. He's not, when he says, you guys probably talked about this last week, the scene where Q says, you're dead.
Oh, yeah. We went way deep into that.
God. Right. Well, if the prophets were to say, you're dead, this is the afterlife, we're God, you wouldn't say the universe isn't so badly designed, or at least most of us wouldn't, because the prophets are, a very serious kind of thing.
I guess it depends on who you are. If you're Bajoran,
he died.
Well, for the Bajorans, certainly the prophets are a very serious kind of thing.
if you were a typical Starfleet officer and you were met by the prophets and they told you they were God, you might still be a little skeptical.
Well, that was the whole point, though. With the original series in TNG, you have the mindset that scientific rationalism is going to overcome our problems and we can fight whatever is ailing us with the scientific rationalism. Even if it's Q, Picard is going to have to outwit him. When you get to Deep Space Nine, I think there's a transition into postmodernism whereby they leave the door open for that, and Sisko might actually be willing to contemplate his place in a divine plan.
I don't agree with that.
Sounds more like classicism than postmodernism to me.
Okay, well let's do a little defining of terms here. Let's see what is exactly classicism. What is it? Classicism?
Classic. I'd say classicism.
Classicism and postmodernism.
Could I
I can explain postmodernism.
Okay, well, could I give a crappy explanation, which I think would help you to say what postmodernism is definitely not, because you'll probably totally disagree with it.
Me? Kirby?
Sure.
Okay. Basically, philosophers can be divided. Philosophers living today can be divided into three basic categories for the most part. And these are very general, and anybody who wants to insist they're in some fourth category, okay, fine, I don't care. But it's helpful for categorizing most philosophers into three basic categories. And those categories are classicism, modernism, postmodernism. Classicism is basically the idea that the old farts were right? That, say, Plato and Aristotle, or even the, Aquinas, or, the ancient philosophers had it basically right. Usually with a lot of modifications, things like slavery we don't agree with anymore. We might add some feminism, but in general, as far as broad, sweeping, fundamental worldview, our worldview is very old, and we're very conservative. We're trying to keep alive sort of old traditions. We believe in, as classicists, and neoclassicists, this is often called, that the old ideas are probably still just as good as they ever were. Like Chesterton would be a big example of a classicist. He would say, we should never get rid of an idea until we know what was good about it. Even if there's some bad things about it, we need to know why it was there before we can be justified in getting rid of it.
And that's a classicist view?
That's I'd say that's classicism in a nutshell. That don't get rid of something until you know what it was good for. Then
if
there's
it ain't broke,
modernism.
don't fix it.
Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's classicism, right? AKA philosophical conservatism. Then, or at least ethical conservatism. Then we have modernism. Modernism is the idea that in the modern age, we have progressed beyond the need for these sort of faith-based traditions, and that we can answer everything usually with a scientific rationalism, and usually it's very much connected with well, there's a lot of different kinds of modernism, so you have to be very careful here. But modernism is often connected with the idea that science is the way to truth. Science and rationalism, or a kind of and modernism would begin with modernism pretty much begins with Descartes, I'd say. If you wanted to put a date on the very, very beginning of modernism in philosophy, it'd probably be Descartes, and then Hume and Kant, and some of those people were the modernists. And there are still modernists around today. I mean, I definitely put a lot of the 20th century thinkers who trumpeted, or triumphed science. The triumph of science is trumpeted in modernism, and there are not all modernists are necessarily anti-religious, but there is a strong rejection of discourses of faith or God to explain things. Postmodernism then comes along and tries to do to modernism what modernism did to classicism. It says not only are our traditions and in many cases our values that come from our religious or faith-based traditions irrational, and but our science is too. Postmodernism would be scientific truth isn't any more true than the old classical ideals were. It's all a big joke.
That's actually a pretty good definition, I think, in general. Postmodernism is the critique of modernism, the critique that we can understand things and fit them into structures.
Right.
But I think I think the prophets are definitely postmodern in many ways, and not classicist, as you'd say, or spiritual. I think they're completely other, and the face of their otherness is a big part of how Deep Space Nine kind of transitions into postmodernism.
Exactly.
Like Brandon was saying, in the Next Generation and Roddenberry-esque Star Trek in particular, it's very scientifically rationalist. It's all about our potential and what we can do. And yes, you're saying that's very modern. And then after the board came and the producers just wanted to kind of go postmodern, a little darker, a little more 90s. And with the prophets, and with the Next Generation and Roddenberry aliens, and you guys have mentioned this several times before, all the aliens are so human. They're just a reflection of us, an aspect of us. Mm-hmm. Whereas the prophets, they're completely other. There's no sort of framework or connection. It's like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Solaris by Stanislaw Lem.
I'm afraid not.
No.
I'm not.
Yeah, I've read it.
It's a postmodern work. It's a postmodern work where it's a science fiction. There's this planet that there's this sort of like life form that covers this planet, and the humans in this science fiction world, the humans haven't encountered any aliens, but they know this planet has some sort of thing going on there, but they don't understand it if it's an alien. And a lot of people argue, like in the scientific community, since it was discovered around 100 years in the story time period, there's an argument whether it's even alien or not. But what it actually is an alien that's so other that there's no real sort of frame of reference. There's nowhere for them to talk. So there's a group of scientists on the planet studying it, and they all kind of, and in the aliens' attempt to communicate back to the otherness, they all sort of revert into their own memories and fears and ideas, and the aliens sort of simulacras, copies the looks of humanity in reflections of, and the main character's fiance committed suicide, and the alien keeps on recreating her, trying to understand him, but there's no sort of resolution. There's no sort of real connection between the two, and I think the writers, particularly in the initial sort of writing of the first season of Deep Space Nine, were definitely trying to do something like that with the prophets.
Tim,
This concept of otherness and simulacra.
I've got an extremely superficial understanding of what you're introducing here to the conversation. I'm just going off the fly here. Are you getting at the fact that if somebody on Deep Space Nine were to dialogue with the prophets, the dialogue would take place in an atmosphere that's familiar to the person? Like for Cisco, when he first talks to the prophets, it's with a baseball game, or it's on the bridge of the Defiant. Are you getting at anything like that?
Exactly, actually, but it's an attempt to find a framework that they understand. That's why the prophets are like the first true aliens in Star Trek, although there's been other aliens similar to kind of varied otherness, but they're the first true completely other aliens in that they don't really have a framework initially with, at least with Cisco in the first episode. So they're forced to kind of, they become like a mirror. And that's kind of the concept that's happening, I think, in Solaris, is that when you're faced with so much otherness, you just kind of revert back into yourself. And that's a very big, it's a concept in postmodern philosophy, is it sort of reverting away from authority back into yourself.
Okay. Well, I got a couple things to say that have kind of stacked up here. First of all, I'm very surprised that you all agreed with my definition of postmodernism so readily, because I am somewhat anti-postmodernist.
But that was a pretty good definition, really. It's a critique of modernism.
Yeah, but I kind of expected my description of postmodernism as sort of anti-scientific, that most of the time when I try to define postmodernism, some postmodernist will tell me, that's a terrible definition and it's not fair and so on, because I'm somewhat anti-postmodernist. So maybe I'm getting better.
Well, no, I would take issue with your friends, and the reason why I take issue with it is one of the key points that the postmodernists are always trying to make is that words are really hard to define. And so the consequence
I've said before that postmodernism is a rejection of the concept of definition.
Well, okay, then you can't define postmodernism according to the postmodernists.
I
don't think that's
not
really
all
a problem.
of them agree with that. So that might be post-structuralism or deconstructionism is perhaps more what I was aiming at there than postmodernism.
I'm a bit of a postmodernist, and for the same reason, I have an enormous respect for religion. Being religious myself, it's because you can have a nebulous concept of what postmodernism. You can have a general idea. Can I tell you exactly what truth is? No, I probably can't. Can I tell you exactly what postmodernism is? Not really. Can I tell you exactly what the prophets are? People who transcend time? Not really. But you can have a general sense. You can have an approximation. You can have the common illustration is a three-dimensional cube drawn on a two-dimensional surface. It's not the same thing, but it's an approximation of it that's at the very least practical. Not accurate, but it's practical.
And I think what's underscored in postmodern philosophy is that everything is really like that. You only really have yourself and the outside, otherness. And otherness, for the understanding of otherness that you're ever going to have, is just going to be like trying to draw a cube on a piece of paper.
Okay, well,
regarding
can I give
this,
my?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, could I give my case for why I think the prophets are more classicist than postmodern?
Knock yourself out.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't want to preclude talking about them being postmodern, if that's what I mean. We want to exhaust that. Well, we never exhaust that, but I don't want to stop people from making comments on that.
No, but I'm really curious. Why do you think they're classicists, not postmodern?
All right. Well, first of all, the whole Bajoran religion is littered with references to real world religions, including those aspects of it which are most closely connected with the real prophets. And the real prophets, their ineffability is something that they have very much in common with the Abrahamic God.
All right. Before we go too far into it, we got to talk about and do a quick definition for ineffable. I've read Good Omens, so I understand the term, but some people might not. And I'm a little fuzzy on it myself, to be honest.
An ineffable thing is a thing that you cannot define clearly in it is bordering on thoughts you cannot conceive of. Right? Or it is a thought that you cannot conceive of, or it is, for example, to give a real infinity is in a sense ineffable, because you cannot actually conceive of infinity. What we usually conceive of as infinity is actually a really, really big thing, rather than, or a really, really large amount of space, rather than an infinite space, which wouldn't look like anything much, would it?
I was just going to add that ineffable, as it's used, though, is usually implied to have some sort of mysticism or religious context.
Right.
Unless you're using
often,
it as an analogy or metaphor. Usually.
And that is true. But what I gave was the general definition of the word ineffable. It's often applied in that context, but what I said is what ineffability always and essentially is, whether it's applying to religion specifically or not.
Right. Well, tell us why you think the prophets are classicists.
Right. Okay. Well, as far as them being ineffable, them being a thing you can't clearly define, there's this whole thing in Isaiah about how God's ways are, my ways are not your ways, saith the Lord, even as the heavens are above the earth. That's in Isaiah 45, I believe.
Right.
The Abrahamic God has always been ineffable.
He's been pretty crazy
in this way. What?
Evil? You better watch it, pal.
Hold on.
I mean, just as far as his moral teaching and actions, we're talking about the Old Testament God.
Hold on. That's a whole other subject for another time. At the moment, I'm trying to talk about how I believe the prophets are referring back to God in the Bible, but also to God in other contexts. There are other non-Abrahamic references definitely present, but there's a whole bunch of Abrahamic references in the prophets, both in the Bajoran religion and in the actual experiences with the prophets. There's this whole thing about, especially late in the series, of Cisco having been created in the image of the prophets, which is there. Okay,
it comes back to the mythology of like Jesus or other religious figures who didn't know who their father was in the Campbellian hero cycle.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that going on there, and that's a classical theme. And the prophets being outside of time is a theme which has been discussed extensively by theologians for probably all through the history of Christianity, certainly. C.S. Lewis devotes a huge amount of time to it in in Mere Christianity, if you've read that. So a lot of this stuff sort of isn't news to people who have a sort of a classical perspective, and a lot of it, the way the prophets interact with and guide the Bajoran people, the way the prophecies don't turn out, the way the prophecies come true but never quite in the way we expected, really hits on themes that are very much present in Christianity and Judaism, and in some degree in Islam as well.
I think the Bajorans and their religion is definitely plays on a lot of different religions, like you said, and the Jews and who the Bajorans are. But I still don't see the necessary connection with the prophets here.
Well, the way revelation happens with the orb experiences and so forth are supposed to stand for divine revelation.
I disagree with that.
Okay, how?
I mean, they're used as study sometimes in episodes of divine revelation, but I think that the prophets fit completely into a natural law in the Star Trek universe. The time travel is commonplace.
Wait a minute. You don't think? Okay, you're saying you think the prophets. Okay.
There are other. We as we can't connect necessarily with them, but I think that they fit completely into natural law. And
explain what do you mean exactly by natural law?
You're not talking about. Yeah, your natural law, as I understand it, is a concept in ethics, or at least in meta ethics. And
I'm not talking about I'm talking more about Humean understanding of prophecy and miracle, or
So you're talking about it fits into the natural order, or to the regular.
No, not at all. No, I'm not talking about any sort of natural or natural religion. I'm talking about Hume tries to define a miracle as something that contradicts natural law, and that is a debated.
And by natural law, Hume.
But by natural law, maybe scientific law is.
Well, can I make my case for postmodernism then? Because what you have is the understanding of the prophets through the Bajoran Vedics, which is legitimate. They can make prophecies that seem to make accurate statements about what's going to happen, or at least quasi-accurate statements. And then you have Jadzia Dax looking at them as just purely wormhole aliens, and so they're looking at it from different perspectives, but they're looking at the same thing. They're just viewing it from different lenses. And so it's elevating the place of the Vedics beyond a point which most modernists would be comfortable with, but it's still affirming the place of the scientific rationalist. And so in that sense, I see it as postmodern.
I think I might actually read the passage. I'll have to take a minute to find it. But I think I might actually read the passage from Mere Christianity, because I really think it actually does speak directly to what the prophets are all about. Would that be okay?
While you're looking for that, there was a couple of things I was going to... Well, one thing I was going to say and one thing I was going to ask. Regarding the whole thing about prophets being the first real alien that isn't just a reflection of some aspect of human culture.
Right.
The thing about the prophets that always got me was they were very zen. Anytime they were giving you direct information, you had absolutely no clue what they were saying, and you had to figure it out on your own. It's a very... I mean, they don't have... It's like somebody took the concepts behind Zen and kind of fused them onto the old Hebrew religion to make these are the prophets, and that's how they talk. Half of what they say, they're speaking to you in Zen cones.
Well, I think that's a phenomenal defense of traditional religious prophecy, because if you look at my religious tradition, the prophecies aren't crystal clear. There's a lot of metaphor. There's a lot of confusion.
Well, all prophecies are like that. That's how they
Okay,
work.
well, I'm really most familiar with my own. So when I look at that, people criticize it and say, well, there's no clarity. But if somebody's communicating to me from this other realm, which is beyond my comprehension, the only way they're going to be able to do it is through approximation, through things that are familiar with me or familiar for that culture at that time. And it's not going to map out exactly the same way you can't map out the 3D object on a two-dimensional surface. And so I think you're necessarily left with some confusion. And I see a lot of these episodes, especially with Vedic Yarka, which is somebody who I hope we talk about today, as emblematic of a lot of the discussions that happen in religious circles. There's not clarity, which we all desire.
Part of the thing.
I don't think, but that's not what I was talking about with otherness, though. I think the lack of clarity in prophecy is so that if you made a prophecy that was specific, then no one would believe it because it would be stupid and wrong. Prophecies have to be interpretive, like Nostradamus.
I notice how stupid and wrong that Daniel prophecy was, prophesying the exact timing of the Messiah now.
What?
When there's exactitude.
What? Wait a minute. What? Say that.
Well, we got to point out that perhaps the Messiah's backstory may have been made up a little bit after the fact, too.
What are we talking about here?
Tim made the point that prophets can't be specific because it would necessarily
be I know.
be
I meant what's the thing in Daniel?
There's a prophecy in Daniel that says the specific timing of Christ. It would happen, so many 465 years, 400 some years after this specific king, the Messiah would come, which was the exact time of Christ.
Well, there was a whole slew of Daniel prophecies that eventually all came true, though. I mean, it wasn't just that one that was accurate.
Yeah. What Tim's point was with exactitude is that they're stupid and wrong. Now, my counterpoint, the point I want to make to that, is in order to make that statement, you have to have an a priori belief that the prophecies are wrong. And I don't grant you that. I don't grant you that assumption.
I think we can grant that assumption if prophecies are miracles.
Now here comes interest. This is the main event of the evening. This is what you and I came to talk about.
Hold on. So you're saying you think miracles are by definition rationally impossible?
Yes.
And do you accept the burden of proof?
Well, I mean that's the
assertion
against miracles. That the evidence for miracles will never override.
Hold on. You're the one making an assertion here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We could just claim ignorance and we wouldn't have the burden of proof. But you're claiming knowledge that there absolutely are no miracles because they're rationally impossible. So do you accept the burden of proof that you've got to prove that they are rationally impossible? That would need
absolutely. I could
a sort of definitional or philosophical proof.
I mean, the basic proof is that for evidence of a miracle, you would have to have evidence that was more compelling than the natural law, or scientific law. Maybe I should use that term. And that's
what specifically is meant by scientific law?
Well, the scientific, not how can I explain this concept?
Well, it's obviously not a scientific law that the science police will arrest you.
I'll give a crack at explaining it. I've got 2 points I want to make against it, but Tim, let me know if I'm getting your point right. Hume made the point that we have sense experience, which testifies to a certain natural order of the universe. There's a way in which it works, which science is doing its best to describe. And our sense experience confirms the uniformity of nature. And when you look at a testimony of a miracle, the common one would be the virgin birth.
That one does come up.
Yeah, it comes up. And so you ask yourself, okay, were the laws of nature suspended such that they allowed a virgin to give birth? Or did some Jewish maiden lie? With Hume, you have to say a wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence. You'd say, I'm more familiar with a liar than the suspension of the laws of the universe, and so I have to assume that she was lying about it. Is this near to the criticism you're trying to make, Tim? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I mean, that's a good definition of Hume of miracles. But I'm
right. Well, okay. Is that the argument you're making or not? Yeah. Sorry. I need to let you finish. Sorry.
Thanks. No, I'm just saying that even more than that, it's not rationally possible to make an argument for a miracle that would override scientific law because of the way scientific law works. If something appears to break scientific law, and then you can actually empirically prove that that's happening, then scientific law can change. Scientific law can become precise. And understanding that aspect more.
All right. Well, there's two
There's
points.
no real understanding within scientific law. Sorry, I just want to fit. There's no real understanding.
I need to let you finish. Yeah.
For any sort of agency or causation outside of scientific law, there's no outside. We haven't found one.
Well, I want to make 2 points, and I know Ben wants to make 2 points. So, Ben, why don't you make your 2 points?
Okay, well, now I've got 3 because he added something. But, all right. First of all, you have not shown that the events, you have not shown that the proposition that a miracle has occurred is rationally impossible, and since I understand the term rationally impossible. To be rationally impossible, it would have to break one of the 3 fundamental laws of thought. It would have to contain an inherent self-contradiction. It would have to somehow violate the law of identity, or it would have to violate the law of the excluded middle and posit something that is neither true nor false. And since miracles do not do any of those things, not at least, okay, some miracles may do those things. Those ones are rationally impossible, and therefore do not happen. But you have not categorically dismissed all miracles by, saying they're rationally impossible, because rationally impossible means violating the fundamental laws of thought. I would not say that rationally impossible means violating what we call scientific law, because scientific law is nothing more nor less than a description of what normally occurs, all other things being equal. That is all scientific law is. And Hume even recognizes this when he talks about the induction fallacy, that just because things have always happened in a certain way does not mean that they never happen in a different way. Now, we need to try and understand the 2 different philosophies that are in conflict here. The 2 different philosophies in metaphysics that are in conflict here are naturalism and supernaturalism. Naturalism is the view that the universe is a unified system in which all events happen according to a single set of rules that we call scientific law, or the laws of nature, in the metaphysical sense, and that nothing else happens. Everything that happens is determined by this unified system. And against that, we have the view of supernaturalism, aka metaphysical dualism. It's also been called that, though that has...
I think metaphysical dualism means something a little differently.
Okay, maybe I'm making a mistake there. Anyway, supernaturalism is the view that instead of a single unitary set of laws governing reality, there are 2 sets of laws that interact in a manner similar to state law and federal law in the U.S. government, in that there's a set of laws that are state laws, but then there's a higher set of laws behind them. And so supernaturalism sort of proposes a dual set of rules for the universe rather than a single unified set of rules for the universe.
I think that's a very good I think that's a very good point. The distinction between natural and supernatural we have here.
Well,
yeah,
Tim,
and that comes out of.
But I think
comes
we
out
still
of-
have a problem. Is that we have no framework for actually dealing with the supernatural. We have no way to measure it or to
Tim, I'd
share
really
an
like you
understanding
to
of what it is.
respond to his point, because that was the first of my 2 points. I'd like you to respond to Emissary Benjamin's point there, that you've got Hume himself saying we don't have the capacity to abstract to this unified way in which nature works. That goes beyond our sense experience. In order to make his point against miracles, all of a sudden he's talking about the governance of the universe, which is the very thing he's trying to disprove in the rest of his texts.
Granted, but you're saying then that miracles could follow natural law even if we don't fully understand it?
I'm
Miracles
saying
would
that there
follow
could be
a secondary set of laws that we haven't got direct access to.
well, there could be exceptions to. I mean, the fact that I experience some sort of uniformity to nature doesn't rule out exceptions, and I think Hume. I would draw on Hume's philosophy to make that argument. I would draw on Hume to refute Hume.
Okay, well, Hume wasn't a complete empiricist.
Well, nobody is. I've never read anyone who is.
No, granted. I suppose I understand what you're saying. I still hold to what I was making my point, though, that there's no framework or no way to really describe a miracle or understand a miracle rationally.
Okay.
And
now,
that there's no.
Okay, now the book to get on this is definitely C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles: A Preliminary Study, second edition, 1960. You have to get the second edition from 1960 because Lewis got beat by a girl.
That's true, he did.
Yeah, I believe Ascom was her name. Thoroughly trounced him in a debate over some mistakes that were in the first edition. The second edition isn't perfect either, but it is a huge improvement. So definitely get second edition or later because it reflects a more mature view of Lewis's thought. This is also the book, because of the mistakes that are in it, that finally dissuaded Lewis from continuing to pursue formal apologetics and philosophy, and instead write the Narnia books. He kind of gave it up. He realized he was beyond it. He was getting into the metaphysical stuff. He was getting beyond his depth as a medieval scholar, and wanted to get back to stories, which were his what he really loved doing. But he this is so it's sort of his last word on philosophy that is of interest to the general public. Of course, his last word is the discarded image, but the discarded image is more for classics majors, as I understand it.
I want to make a point about the Hume argument.
Sorry, a little bit of a tangent there, but
it's not a tangent. I mean, recommended reading. Let's read Hume's Principles of Human Understanding, C.S. Lewis on Miracles. They're excellent texts, and they're really engaging, and both of them make me think deep thoughts. So for sure, reading lists are great. But Tim,
Lewis draws a lot from Hume, actually, which is very surprising.
I want to make a point, and it's about the notion of requiring some sort of a causal structure, because as near as I can tell, there's some sort of circular reasoning going on, whereby Hume says miracles are rare and we can't accept these rarities, things that are outside of our general sense experience, and so they don't happen. And the reason why I say
I think that is sort of what he's saying, because in the end of Miracles, he kind of says, but Jesus really happened and did stuff and performed miracles.
Well, he says that because he's living in Scotland, where atheism is a crime, isn't he?
Well, yeah, I do think that. I think if anyone of the, if any of these thinkers are leaning more towards atheism, it's probably Hume.
Well, when I read Chapter 10 of Principles Concerning Human Understanding, I think it was the title, I came away thinking he was an atheist. Like, he left on an atheistic note. But the reason why I want to call that circular is because...
Actually, I think it's an inquiry concerning human understanding. Principles concerning human understanding was John Locke.
John Locke. Well,
Yeah.
both at the same time, and it left me very confused.
Yeah, they're very...
It would.
The reason why I want to saddle Hume with the accusation of circular reasoning is because he will say, well, I'll give you Bob Larimer's example. He says, suppose you have two people talking in the forest, and the first person says, there are no wolves in the forest. And the second person says, oh yes, there is. Here's evidence. Here's some wolf tracks. And the third person says, those can't possibly be wolf tracks because there are no wolves in the forest.
Right.
Now,
we know what circular reasoning is.
Well, you know what circular reasoning is, but Hume says rare things don't happen. And he'll tackle the...
I don't think that's what he says at all.
Well,
he tries to first define what a miracle is, and I think
he's going to talk about a violation of the natural order of things, the uniformity of nature, however you want to word it. And he'll use the example of healing an amputee. All my new atheist friends are talking about, how come you never see an amputee healed? Well, look, read David Hume. He talks about the healing of an amputee. Where there was a town in Spain, and the name of it escapes me right now, where everyone in the town would testify to the fact that they passed by this fellow every day on their walk to, or every week on their walk to church, and he had his legs healed. He was an amputee who was healed, and the whole town would testify to it. And Hume came along and said, no, their testimony is invalid because, in my experience, miracles don't happen. And so he says the reason why we don't accept miracles is because there's no evidence for them. And along comes a whole town that says, here's evidence for a miracle. He says that's not possibly evidence for a miracle because, in my experience, miracles don't happen. In my experience,
it's more subtle than that, though. He's saying that the evidence that the townspeople are offering is not greater than the evidence or the understanding that we already have that people can achieve this.
In there, that's my
quality
accusation that it's circular. But my accusation that it's circular is because miracles are, by definition, irregularities. So he's saying irregularities don't happen because, in my experience, everything's regular. Oh, well, here's an irregularity. I don't believe it because.
Well, he's saying that there's never been an irregularity in this case that had enough evidence to overcome the fact that it's such an extraordinary claim. I guess that's getting back to I don't know if it's originally Carl Sagan who said it, but he said a lot that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Well, the whole testimony of a township to me is significant. Hume's
It's not significant at all. I think the human senses aren't very reliable at all.
Look, we never resort to explanations of mass hallucination unless we want to disprove miracles. I've never heard that kind of explanation ever resorted to unless it's to disprove a miracle.
Oh, it's talked about often. With mysticism, with Pentecostal faith healings, things like that.
Again, he just said it's never taught outside of religion.
But
that you never offer that kind of explanation, the explanation of mass hallucination, unless it's a miracle, and usually a religious miracle.
Well, I don't think that type of stuff happens.
Sometimes there's magician, hocus pocus.
What about or experience perhaps with aliens or ghosts?
Yeah, but that's never happened to a massive number of people.
It's kind of the same thing.
But it's never happened.
Sure, it
to
has.
There's never been a mass experience of that all at the same time, though.
My point is, Hume is saying, I experience regularities regularly, and I don't experience irregularities that often. Therefore, I'm not going to believe the irregularities.
I completely understand, and I mean, granted, that's a sort of a fair critique, but I do think Hume understood that critique and did.
I know he understood it. I read it in the second half of chapter 10 of his
books. I got a couple things I could maybe say here that might help us a little bit. I hope. and I hope I stay on task too and not go on a tangent, because the tangent wouldn't help us as much. But okay, basically, here we go. There's at least two things. First of all, I don't believe in a strict uniformity of nature. But that doesn't mean we have to throw out all of science and technology. I'm a computer science major, so I depend on things happening regularly pretty heavily in order to have my job. What actually, all that science, normal science, and especially applied science, really require is the general predictability of nature. That is all that, at least what I'd regard as legitimate science, depends on. It doesn't depend on
it's very precise and very subtle. I mean, the measurements we have of the movement and activity of subatomic particles are like ridiculously precise, down to unimaginable scales. If those are off by even a little bit,
nobody disagrees with that.
But that's what I'm saying. Is I think that science is it's an enclosed framework for understanding the universe. You can't. I don't think you can't agree with some of it and disagree with some other part of it, because
certainly
if you disagree with some part of it, then it contradicts everything.
For example, psychology. I can certainly disagree with the views of the
there's an argument
establishment in a number of areas, especially in psychology and sociology and all the stuff about the evolution of morals, which is based on no evidence whatsoever, and a whole bunch of stuff that the modern scientific establishment believes in can be consistent.
I think even within the field of psychology, there's sort of a debate of what aspect of psychology is science and what is not, and what is analysm.
Yeah, but the same can be said for quantum mechanics. I mean, there's a great deal of quantum mechanics that's interpretation of what happens at, say, the collapse of the wave function. Even within physics, there's a debate as to what has been advanced mathematically or evidentially.
But there's an agreement that there is an answer. There's always the forefront of science. There's always the aspect of science that we don't know yet. But there's
sure. I agree with that.
Hold on though.
It doesn't mean it's unknowable.
What precisely do you mean by this assertion that so you're saying there is an answer somewhere for why things happen, but it's not necessarily knowable. Is that what you just said?
I think it's potentially knowable, but we don't know it now.
Okay. Well, that seems to seriously undermine your whole statement about there being no exceptions to scientific laws.
No, but that isn't, because my point earlier was that even if there was a really crazy miracle, we think of an example. Here's a really simple example, a very early type of miracle. Back in ancient Babylon, they looked at the stars a lot. They didn't have TV, and they looked at the stars a lot. And there were some people who just studied the stars a long time, and eventually they say the heavens in general, and they were able to predict eclipses. And that was really important to the king of Babylon, because bad things were always supposed to happen, and he would. There's even talk he'd abdicate the throne and give it to some criminal, and then he'd kill the criminal afterwards. And this was seen. These types of things were seen as a miracle because they didn't understand why or how that would happen. How something.
You're talking about eclipses.
And the prediction of the eclipses. But actually, it's not really a miracle, because it actually fits science once you actually understand the science. Well, so if within the frame, let me finish. But within the framework of rational empiricism, anything you encounter that is contradictory, you can eventually make fit into everything, and then everything will eventually make sense together, including it. In fact, make more sense. Because these ancient Babylonian mystics or
excuse me,
whatever, they didn't actually understand heliocentrism. They didn't understand the Earth was going around the sun. They just looked at stuff a really long time and were able to predict cycles.
Yeah, but Tim, I think that's wonderful. Everything that you're saying, I think, is wonderful. That there's a rational structure to the universe and the way things work. That fits in with my worldview entirely. That people are superstitious and they make wrong assumptions about nature. And some people anthropomorphize nature and they're very pagan about. Like that fits entirely within my worldview. I don't see how that advances.
I think that fits better with the scientific worldview, though.
Yeah, but I like science too. I've read
There's no the scientific worldview. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I mean,
you
what
were
do you
calling
do?
the
You take
materialist
poll of scientists to establish what the scientific worldview is.
Well,
there's
I guess
a materialistic worldview, but there's no scientific worldview.
Well, there's a scientific method and approaching.
There's scientism. We can agree that there's scientism.
There's an old joke along those lines.
What's that?
There's an old joke along those lines. Says, ask two scientists a question, and you'll get 3 answers.
I like it.
Now hold on. Okay, that.
But I still think science is the only thing that's ever given us anything like objective truth.
Well, I need to jump in here for just a moment.
Not at all. I've never heard objective truth from religion. I've heard a lot of. I've never heard objective agreements. I've never heard an agreement on an objective concept between 2 people within the same religion. Not completely.
Okay.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah, I never got to
that may have been a sort of exaggeration, but there's definitely religions tend to separate and disagree.
I never got to the second point I thought would be helpful, and I think it might help us a lot at this point, if I could get to it.
Sure.
All right, and I'm hoping this will actually help both sides be able to see the other side's perspective a little more clearly.
I think, or at least between me and Brandon, I think we see the other side very clearly and understand it. Just disagree.
Yeah, that's true. I think I could probably make a good argument for your side, and I think you could probably make it.
I think you did a better argument for my side, at least at some points.
Well, all right. Well, I still think this would help our discussion. At least I hope it will. I think that whether you now I've lost it. Oh, drat. I'm sorry. It was really important, and it was about epistemology and
science is the only way to know.
Well, I'm going to have to pop in here then while you're thinking about that, and say that I'll be honest with you guys. Right now, my eyes are really glazing over, so I'm lost. I've probably been lost for the past half an hour. No offense to you guys. I'm sure that it's all making perfect sense to each and every one of you, but I'm sure to our more layman audience, I think we've lost them by this point. Plus, we've also I think, lost the whole prophet. Yeah, we've lost the whole prophet's perspective too. I've completely lost what we're arguing about and how it relates to them. So I don't know if we can either steer it back on track or if we want to
I think
backtrack.
It's a good point anyway.
Here, I'll bring it back to reality. I'll bring it back to Star Trek. Boy, am I lost in Star Trek.
Hey, Star Trek is real. It's just not real yet.
Yeah, that's right, man.
What's that town in Iowa has a statue because it's the future birthplace of Captain James T. Kirk?
Yeah, I'm not lost, actually.
Yeah, we've already passed the eugenics wars, so, well, anyway.
Let's see if I can... there's a conversation between Cisco and Dax that I want to draw out. I can read the conversation to you, but it'll take 45 seconds, but I guess you guys won't mind.
No, go right ahead.
Dax. They're talking about Bajoran prophecies and whether or not it's worthwhile to follow Bajoran prophecies to guide Starfleet practice. So
Three Vipers episode?
Exactly.
Whether what guides Starfleet practice?
The Bajoran prophecies ought to be guiding Starfleet practice.
Oh.
So Dax says, let me guess, you're reading up on Bajoran prophecies concerning the emissary, Cisco. There are hundreds of them. Most of them are vague, some of them are contradictory, but just enough truth in a few of them to make me wonder. Dax, you mean some of them have come true? Cisco, if you interpret them in a certain way, yes. Jax. And so now you're wondering if Trekor's prophecy is going to come true as well. Siskel, I have to admit, it's getting harder to ignore. Jax. But Benjamin, there's every reason to believe we'll be able to destroy the comet. Cisco. I know, but I'm becoming more and more concerned that if I don't send the Cardassians home, something else will go wrong. Jax. The gates of heaven will burn and be cast open. Let me ask you something. If you'd never heard of Trekor's prophecy, what would you do? Cisco. I'd continue working on the communications relay. Jax. Then it seems to me that you have a choice. You can either make your own decisions or you can let these prophecies make them for you. Cisco. As soon as the Defiant is ready, have the Cardassians meet us on board. And so he immediately says, okay, my Starfleet mentality says I will make my own decisions. I won't let the prophets make.
I think there's a few things happening there. First, I think he's choosing autonomous freedom in an existential sense over even if the prophets are true. But I think actually, because in the Star Trek universe, the prophets completely into the laws of the Star Trek universe. Maybe not these bullshit, these absurd prophecies. You should actually go to the prophets and get their help whenever you can. I think the smartest people were Barry Waddle and Negus
Zach.
Negus Zach, who actually went to the prophets and tried to get help with business. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Did the prophets help Cisco by destroying that Dominion fleet?
Okay.
That's one of the things about the prophets that kind of I've been wondering about is I don't think they were ever actually giving prophecy. These things exist outside of time, past, present, and future are all one to them. So they see the future and they tell you about the future, but they're not doing it to give you information. It's just how I spent my summer vacation. It's idle water cooler talk that the Bajorans overheard.
Hold on, I was about to bring that up. The prophecies aren't telling Cisco what to do. When do they have any imperatives in them?
Well, they're fire and stuff. But I think even the point
that's not
of
an
that
imperative.
episode,
that's a fact.
They do a lot of if-then statements. If you do this, this will happen. If you do something else, this will happen. So they're giving you
prophecies in the Bible do that, but I'm not aware. I don't remember the Bajoran prophecies doing that. Do they? When do they do that?
I don't remember exactly they go, but they're pretty Nostradamus-y where the Bajorans ones were. They were very figurative.
They seem to say what will happen. They don't seem very often to say what you should do when that time comes.
Until the very end when they pull that horrible Deus Ex Machina ending.
But I think that the point of the episode in the end was that you can't interpret these prophecies anyway, and at the end, looking back,
you think the comet being split into 3 parts was Deus Ex Machina?
No, I meant the end of the series, not the end of that particular episode.
Oh, okay. I don't really think the end of the series was either very much, but okay. I got a couple things to say on why prophecies are vague. That might be interesting. This is sort of coming a little bit from my Latter-day Saint perspective. One of God's most important goals is, I believe, to protect our free choice. And if we were given information about the future that was specific enough and clear enough and not open to interpretation, but absolutely clear then we wouldn't have a choice.
That's absurd. You give us a clear picture of the future that's useful to us, or you don't. Giving us a gray, hazy Nostradamus type thing, all that can be is dangerous.
I could go off on a wild tangent about JFK and CIA ESP experiments to explain that, but that would take a little far afield.
Well, prophecies are, I believe, intended for they usually seem to get transmitted a lot wider than to whom they are intended. I think they're quite often intended for a very specific group of people. like in they're often put into sort of images, because what they are sort of giving you sort of multiple layers of meaning, which you can look back at and find meaning in history when things happen.
Well, Tim,
they use imagery because they're being made up, and they're prophets because you can look at it after the fact and be like, oh, that the fiery prince was JFK, and the whatever, I don't even remember any Nostradamus.
Tim, I want to ask you this. You say it's only dangerous that God would reveal something to us in a nebulous, hazy sort of way, rather than a clear and distinct way.
You could interpret it wrong, but because you're interpreting it as part of a mystical experience with the Holy Ghost or whatever mystical way that you interpret Revelation, you think it's absolutely right, and then you have a reason to do who knows what.
Well, people can pervert any sort of truth. It doesn't matter. You can pervert.
But only religious truth is the type of truth that you can pervert it and just leave it absolutely. Then you have excuse to do terrible things.
Totally disagree.
Yeah, it depends on where you stand on the whole Euthyphro question. If you stand with Euthyphro, then certainly you can a revelation could in principle justify anything. But if you stand with Socrates, that there is an objective set of moral values which are not subjective to God's whim at the moment, then you judge revelations against those standards, whether to find out whether they're true or not.
I don't.
The point I want to make is that God can make a nebulous claim about the future. I mean, we can debate sociology till we're blue in the teeth. Okay, atheists did X, Christians did Y. We can have that argument, but I don't.
That's the association fallacy. Anyway, I don't.
Yeah, I don't know that it would further the discussion. All I'm saying is, God could reveal, "Hey, look it. There's a Messiah coming," or "Hey, look it. The end of the world is coming. I'm not going to tell you when it is. I'm not going to give you exact science. I'm not going to give you anything. But that knowledge could reform my life. And sure, some people can pervert it. You could get a Harold Camping that perverts it. But that knowledge could still reform my life for the better.
I'm not sure how any sort of prophecy, particularly about the end of the world, or how the material world that the death is better than the material world, could be a positive thing.
Oh, go to a church, my goodness, where people are talking about eschatology at least once a month. Lives are reformed based on the knowledge of the fact that this world is not infinite.
Or go to FEMA website and look up all their stuff on disaster preparedness.
FEMA?
Well, yeah.
I think being prepared for real disasters is different.
What's FEMA?
Federal Emergency Management Administration.
Well, you don't know which disasters are going to be real until they happen, do you?
I don't know,
but I mean, hurricanes will happen.
Government.
Yeah, I mean, biblical prophecy is using mysticism and religious messages as opposed to Doppler radar, but it's still predicting the future. Any kind of meteorology is predicting the future based on stuff you're getting. Maybe all the prophets throughout history have been just getting a dose of the crazy. Maybe they've got a vibe of the future. I don't know. But as far as the prophecy itself being good or bad, it's a prediction for the future. So it's not any different from any other prediction of the future, regardless of how the source material is. All the source material does is determine how accurate it is. But predicting impending disaster gives people a chance to prepare against it, prepare to survive it. Their duct tape and their bottled water ready.
The world will end at one point, according to some sort of Abraham.
I totally agree with you. It's an assumption. In order to discard the prophecies, you have to assume that there is no inspiration behind them. In order for me to
you don't have to assume. I think inspiration is something that would have to be asserted. I mean, you can't.
I'm getting lost in who's saying what here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I probably was a little lost there.
Folks, maybe we should do a bit of a subject jump.
Sure.
Because I think we've got into a bit of a rut and a bit of a dead end here.
Well, there's one question I'd really like you guys to try to answer for me.
Sure.
I mean, and this relates directly to Deep Space Nine.
Okay.
Over and over again, it got repeated, "We are of Bajor." That was the prophet's statement. It's why they sent the orbs. But they never actually explained what that meant, because the prophets came from the wormhole. They weren't born on Bajor and migrated to the wormhole. They were always in the wormhole, and they used Bajor as a dumping ground for their inmates. And they never actually explain what the whole "we are of Bajor" thing means. Or did they, and I just missed it? What do they mean by "we are of Bajor"? Why do they say Cisco was of Bajor? What was that all about?
I assumed it was a sort of analog for the Abrahamic covenant and the whole thing about Israel being God's chosen people.
Of has a dual meaning. That's a really important thing to point out too. I mean, with Kant, the duality is explicit. Critique of pure reason. Are you critiquing pure reason, or is pure reason doing the critiquing? Or you could have,
Oh, I never noticed that before.
Yeah, you could have the house of pain, where pain belongs to the house, or the house of Martok. The house actually belongs to Martok. Like, there's a duality with the word of. We are of Bajor. Is that to say Bajor belongs to them, and they take ownership over Bajor? Or perhaps it's the Bajorans who have taken ownership of the prophets?
Or maybe the prophets are the ancestors of the Bajorans in the distant future.
Good heavens.
I always kind of thought that was a connection, that they either at one point evolved from Bajor or had some sort of connection with Bajor that way.
Well, I'm not that far into it.
Although that's conjececture, I think. I think that's conjecture.
Total conjecture. It has nothing to do with anything in any of the scripts.
I mean, they are outside of time and looking at time differently, so it's not implausible for them to be the further evolution of Bajoran life, but that still brings up the other half of it, and maybe that duality of is what explains it. But if the prophets are of Bajor because they are the 1 billion years from now evolution of Bajoran, why is Cisco of Bajor?
Because his mother was really a prophet.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Cisco's a Bajor because his mother turns out to have been a prophet. The prophets created Cisco in order to have an emissary.
Yeah, that was part of that whole final season meltdown where it just ruined Deep Space Nine.
I thought.
Although I really like the parallel sort of metaphor of him being a science fiction writer in pre rights Harlem. I like that aspect.
It's 50s.
I really thought it was fitting
late
that
40s,
early 50s gave him that vision.
Yeah. I was disappointed not to be the Power Rates because it's such great scenes, but
I'm really disappointed in the Power Rates. I don't like the concept of the Power Rates. I think that kind of.
I am a Power Rate. How do you like that?
I have to say the Power Wraiths are another reason why I really think there's a lot of the whole Abrahamic story going on, because the Power Wraiths are the devils.
That's what I was saying. That was just kind of a lazy religious interpretation, making it Manichaean or Zoroastrianism, make it so if the Power Wraiths are gods, they have the devils, and then they could fight.
Oh, and an entire section of my book was dedicated to Descartes' seduction of I win, but that would derail us too much for the
let's save that for the I win episode. She's gonna get her own episode.
I thought the Power Race were absolutely brilliant in Star Trek history.
I think I like that aspect. I just wish. I mean, I think part of the problem was the end of the series just felt rushed. I think they had a great setup that they could have strung this out for 2 or 3 more seasons. Give us something more instead of a quick, here's the cure. Thanks for the cure. We're sorry we started the war. We'll all get along now. Thank you. Good night. Oh, by the way, I need to go jump into this volcano.
Yeah,
it fell apart at the end because the Pa Wraiths, first they were just an idle mention. They were an odd little ghost story, and then it got developed that they were more than that. They were prophets who got evicted, and it could have been something great and really gotten into it, but they never had time to really develop the Pa Wraiths.
Not as much as they should have gotten, but that's the way things go. I could see in the final episode a sort of microcosm of what the final season would have been, and because I got to see that at all versus the show getting canceled without any kind of resolution, I think it was good that we got to see that versus just ending without any resolution at all. So.
My take is quite different. My problem with the Pa race is how I was talking about how the prophets are this other, and then the introduction of the Pa race is just giving this sort of dualist human morality to them that is easy to create a cool story about the God and the devil. But I think it kind of went against the concept of them being other that I thought was so intriguing when they were first introduced.
Well, I don't think the existence of the devil in Christian theology somehow undercuts the ineffability of God. So I don't think it does that in the case of the prophets either.
Well, let's have a
No, I'm not talking about the ineffability. I'm talking about their otherness, and then just kind of assuming they have the same dualist morality that fits into ours and fits into this Zoroastrian view of the world's.
Well, let's have
BGW. Didn't we have an episode of incoherent aliens who absolutely cannot be understood in TNG?
There's a few of them. There was the Sand people. There was the people who lived in the Romulan black hole. There was a few aliens that were very other, but I just thought.
And Jalad.
Yeah,
those
are all some of the best.
Entirely other, actually. If you go and watch that episode again, understanding the key to the code, you can kind of get a vague understanding of what they're saying.
Granted, but I just thought the way that they portrayed the trying to communicate with the prophets was a better example of this otherness concept I was talking about.
I think we should probably wrap the episode up.
Yeah, this is probably how long?
We didn't get. I had this thing I really wanted to read. About God being outside of time.
Go ahead.
Which, if we're going to do the prophets episode, we've definitely got to read this. This is in Mere Christianity, and it talks about the whole outside of time thing, non-locality, xenotemporality of God, and I really think this is speaking in a lot of ways to what the prophets are all about, at least in terms of metaphysics. And he says this. While he's talking about prayer, he says, I should have to deal with the difficulty that some people find about the whole idea of prayer. A man put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I cannot swallow is the idea of him attending to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I have found that quite a lot of people feel this. Now, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine a God attending to any number of applicants, if only they come one by one, and he has an endless time to do it in. So what is really at the back of this difficulty is the idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that is, of course, what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there is room for very little in each. That is what time is like. And of course you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series, this arrangement of past, present, is not simply the way life comes to us, but the way all things really exist. We tend to assume that the whole universe and God himself are always moving on from past to future, just as we do. But many learned men do not agree with that. It was the theologians who first started the idea that some things are not in time at all. Later, the philosophers took it over, and now some of the scientists are doing the same. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His life does not consist of moments following one another. If 1,000,000 people are praying to him at 10:30 tonight, he need not listen to them all in that one little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30 and every other moment from the beginning of the world is always the present for him. If you like to put it that way, he has all eternity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. It's difficult. Something, not the same, but a bit like it. Suppose I'm writing a novel. I write, Mary laid down her work. Next moment came a knock at the door. For Mary, who has to live in the imaginary time of my story, there is no interval between putting down the work and hearing the knock. But I, who am Mary's maker, do not live in that imaginary time at all. Between writing the first half of that sentence and the second, I might sit down for 3 hours and think steadily about Mary. I could think about Mary as if she were the only character in the book, and for as long as I pleased, and the hours I spent in doing so would not appear in Mary's time, the time inside the story, at all. Now, he goes on to talk about how God is not only outside of time, but he's been making the fallacy of putting God inside of a pseudo-time, in which he fast forwards and rewinds as though he was watching a film. And he said God's not only outside of time, God's outside of pseudo-time as well. But that gets into more complexities than we can probably introduce at this point. But the point is, the whole idea of God being xenotemporal, being outside of time, is a familiar concept for people who are really deep into Christian theology. And so DS9's getting it right, at least from our point of view in Christian theology.
I take a little issue with that, just that I don't think the prophets are completely outside of time. I think they're
it certainly gives every indication of that, as far as I can tell.
Well, I think that time travel and being in a place like a wormhole outside of time is not really outside of like the understanding of time or the understanding of order inside the Star Trek universe. Where I think Christian theology or the view of God is at even further outside. I think maybe like you said, we're talking about pseudo time. Perhaps they're in some sort of pseudo time.
Well, there could be a distinction. There could be a distinction between being outside of sequential events and being outside of cause and effect.
And what's the difference?
Well, I mean, for example, if I hold an object up in my hand is the cause of it not falling. Well, it's happening simultaneously. But if you watch some of these Doctor Who episodes, they make no sense whatsoever. I mean, there's a complete violation of cause and effect, such that you can't even wrap your mind around it. So,
well, it's just lousy writing, or I mean, it's just silly writing. Let me put it like that, not lousy writing.
I think
silly writing. Doctor Who is brilliantly written. It's just written silly.
I think coming back to the prophets, though, as I think anything they do, any sort of communication they do, they have agency, which is locked within a cohesive Star Trek universe that makes sense within the Star Trek universe. Not everyone in the Star Trek universe acts that way. They often seem to act like whatever they're doing now matters, when they could just zoom around a star and go back in time and fix everything, every problems that they have right now, by making it so the Romulans didn't exist at all or something like that. But there is a cohesive order inside the Star Trek universe.
Most of the time when they do time travel, there are
secret, and really only Spock and very few other people know them.
Yeah, the first time the Enterprise ever traveled back in time was when a black hole exploded, or something like that. They got sucked in. It was something to do with getting caught around. This was going all the way back to the original series. They had it was actually 2 episodes. It was supposed to be but they changed it to make it 2 independent episodes. One had them trapped around, I think it was a black hole, and they were getting sucked in, and they had to do something to break free. And when they did break free, it spun their chronometers backwards and ended up back to before they got stuck.
There's been tons of time travel. There's been chronotons. There was the time that Quark's cousin tried to sabotage his shuttle, and that's how made them travel through time. And there's lots of different time travel methods. My only point is that in that universe with where time travel is at all possible, that suddenly becomes the most important tool for any sort of war or economics or anything like that.
Sure.
Any other sort of weapon is secondary.
There was an episode of Voyager that dealt with the weaponizing of time travel.
Yeah, and they did have the temporal investigators in that Deep Space Nine episode that tried to keep them.
Indeed, Enterprise was all about temporal Cold Wars. I
actually did like that aspect of Enterprise, and I will very rarely defend Enterprise, but I liked the temporal Cold War stuff. I just felt like it needed its own show, not really a Star Trek show, but well, I don't know, maybe.
My only point is that time travel is part of that universe.
And with the Prophets, though, it isn't exactly time travel. I mean, they make it pretty clear from the first episode that they're non-linear, that their order of events doesn't follow the same order as the rest of us, and they don't come out and say it, but there does seem to be a little bit of a choice. Well, there was that one episode where they brought the emissary from 100 years ago into the future, and then when they were done with him, they sent him back to the past. So they do have some conscious control over how they perceive linear things inside the wall, and can pick and choose to do a little time travel. But with them being non-linear, though, the events are only just out of order, but it also kind of means that they don't have to actually have time flow at a rate of 1 second per second.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of circular causation going on. That's the sort of thing that's only possible, I think, in a story because of some of the logical problems it might create in real life. But there's circular causation going on where they create the emissary in order to have the emissary teach them about the nature of linear existence in time. Which is something they don't know about, they want to find out about, therefore they create the emissary to tell them about it. Okay, now we're going to have the big battle of scientism, probably pretty quick here, which we haven't really had. We launched it, but we didn't really have it. We don't have time to have it tonight.
But I think within the Star Trek universe, scientism definitely wins.
Well, let's have that
not
discussion.
On DS9.
Let's have that discussion in some of the forthcoming weeks.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Trekosophy. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/Trekosophy. So check out our website with episodes available at www.trekosophy.com. Our episodes are also available as downloads on iTunes. Check us out on Facebook, and coming soon, Twitter.
Woo!
Oh.
I'm pretty atheist, and I'm all for the Prophets.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll have to get into why I don't think that makes sense in the episode.
Bill has probably the best voice.
Oh, he's got a radio voice, all right.
Oh yeah, Bill is awesome. He has been making us these really awesome, like, introductory routine things.
I heard that.
Okay, he's here, so let's not inflate his head too big.
I think we have to have our metaphysics in order before we can do that.
Is this better?
Yeah, you sound pretty good now.
As
long as you don't breathe out through your nose right into the mic. That's why I said, okay, kind of move it to the side.
Yeah, try not to breathe or say anything.
Yeah, try not to breathe.
Yes, don't breathe.
I made edits that I hope made everyone involved sound more intelligent.
Okay, Brandon, you might want to slide
I think
microphone off to the side a little bit. You're getting a lot of wind, too, now.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Do you want me to reiterate what I said then?
No,
I
that's
think
okay.
I got it. I
don't want to sound like a whole bunch of hot air. That would be very bad.
No, you're doing okay. It's a weird and obscure art form, editing.
What you think would make a great show, and what you think would make an absolutely horrible show, but because you're a Trekkie, you might actually still watch it.
You can't do something like that the same way twice, and it just doesn't come out as good and stuff. But
there's nothing wrong with pushing your favorite author when we get to talking about Hungarian folk. We'd be mentioning Stephen Bruce, but
we're going to talk about Hungarian folklore on a.
If I can figure out a way to do it, we would.
Okay, you will get extra bonus points if you can figure out a way to make that relevant to the show.
Yeah.
I could help with.
I don't know what to cut and what to keep.
There are parts where we kind of go on tangents and bad things happen. And Chris is like, I'm gonna have these parts at certain parts.
We did kind of get into some high level shop talking for philosophy stuff, but you know what? Trekkies deserve it, don't they? Well, maybe it might be that it's raining outside my apartment. That just makes all technology go wonky.